All right, you have been listening to President Trump at a campaign rally for Georgia Republican Senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler ahead of their Tuesday runoff elections against Democrats Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. It was a speech that lasted about an hour and 20 minutes by my count and alternated between boosting the two Republican candidates and alternately the president airing his grievances about the November 3rd presidential election. The president began his remarks with this statement, quote, "There's no way we lost Georgia." He went on to say that was a rigged election. Reminder, Joe Biden won the presidential contest, 306 electoral votes to 232, 81 million popular votes over Donald Trump's 74 million. Let's get right to David Becker. David is the executive director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. He is a CBS News election law expert and contributor. And David, I know you are listening alongside us. There is so much to unpack from what we just heard there in the last hour and 20 minutes. Overall, what we heard from the president at various points throughout the night was the president continuing to push various baseless claims that the election was somehow stolen from him. He cited various battleground states, but I want you to start off, David, by just reminding us, what have various states and specifically courts of law found about the claims of widespread voter fraud that the president and his supporters allege?
Yeah, I mean, today was another sad day for democracy in a line of sad days that we've experienced lately, watching the president of the United States delegitimize our elections in a way that would make Vladimir Putin blush. You know, if you didn't watch this speech, you could spend your time much better watching Gabriel Sterling of the Georgia Secretary of State's office from earlier today talk about all of these false claims, this long litany of QAnon conspiracy theories, and debunk them one by one in his speech today when he was giving his press conference. The simple fact of the matter is we're 62 days past the election. The rules were set in place long before the election. In Georgia, for instance, those rules were set by a Republican-dominated legislature, signed into law by a Republican governor, and implemented and enforced by a Republican Secretary of State. And in every case, Georgia held an election that should be an envy for other states. It was incredibly secure. Paper ballots counted and recounted 3 times, once entirely by hand. No software involved in that whatsoever. The overall security of the system was the most secure election Georgia has ever had. And in fact, this is the most secure election America has ever had. And the courts have agreed. There have been over 60 cases filed just post-election, just in the last 62 days. 60 cases filed. And the Trump campaign has failed to make a single credible case of voter fraud in any of those cases. Every single court has found that the claims made by the Trump campaign are unsupported by any facts. Many of these cases were decided on their merits. In Georgia, a case was decided on its merits by a Trump-appointed judge. The same can be said in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in many other places. And it's time for patriots to stand up for American democracy and for the election officials of both parties all around the country who worked so hard to make this election a success during a pandemic.
So the president threw out a lot of numbers when it comes to election results. He talked about dead people allegedly voting and issues with voting machines. We don't have time to go through every single claim, but can you fact check at least some of that for us, particularly with respect to the Dominion voting machines, because that's something that we have seen continue to have some traction in certain circles, this baseless, unproven theory.
Right. So first of all, every one of the claims that he raised tonight, if you go back and read the transcript of that very troubling call that he had on Saturday with the Georgia Secretary of State, they're the exact same claims he made there. And the Georgia Secretary of State shot every one of them down. Gabriel Sterling of his office shot every one of them down today. The fact is there's zero evidence that any voting machines malfunctioned. In Georgia, Every single ballot is paper, and that paper has been reviewed and counted by bipartisan teams in a hand count. Think about this. We're not talking about putting them into a scanner. We're talking about human beings looking at all 5 million ballots in Georgia and confirming that the winner in that race by over 11,000 votes was Joe Biden. In Wisconsin, there are several counties that use Dominion systems, and the Trump campaign had the opportunity to ask for recounts throughout the state of Wisconsin, a statewide recount. They could have asked for a recount in the entire state. They asked for a recount in only 2 counties, neither of which uses the Dominion systems. They're not serious about these claims. They know they can't make these claims in court. They know they can't stand up to these claims in court. So what they do is they go into social media, they go into phone calls with election officials where they're trying to bully elected state public servants, and they go into speeches like tonight to spread disinformation that is going to be replayed over and over on propaganda networks in Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. And we have to be seriously concerned about that.
So I also want to ask you, David, about the president's comments regarding Vice President Mike Pence. So on Wednesday, he's set to preside over the electoral vote count over that session where you'll have members of Congress counting those votes. But let's listen to some of what President Trump said about Vice President Pence and what he perceives to be the vice president's role when that happens on Wednesday. Let's listen.
There's nothing the radical Democrats will not do to get power that they so desperately crave, even the outright stealing of elections like they're trying to do with us. We're not going to let it happen. Over the past, and I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much. Over the past few weeks, we've demonstrated that we won the election in a landslide. Almost 75 million people voted for me. The most of any incumbent president in the history of our country.
So, David, I want to get your thoughts specifically with respect to the president's comments about the vice president. What did you hear in those comments? What appears to be the choice here for Vice President Mike Pence?
Well, what I've heard is that the president continues to be very ignorant or confused about how elections work in the United States generally, and specifically with regard to the Electoral College. I think Vice President Pence probably has a much clearer view of his role, and it's similar to the role then Vice President Biden played in 2017 when he presided over the counting of the electoral votes that elected now President Trump, and the role that Vice President, at that time, Vice President Gore, as the losing candidate of the presidential election, played during as he presided over the counting of the electoral votes in 2001 in the election that made George W. Bush president. It is largely a ministerial role. They are simply counting the ballots as passed by the states. We live in a federalist society. That's why we have the Electoral College, and the states have the control of their own elections. And every single state has certified by law their elections. We know exactly who won. We know exactly how the elections were played out. Those certifications now reside at the National Archives, and they will be presented on Wednesday. And Vice President Pence's role is simply to preside over that process as contemplated by the Constitution and the Electoral Count Act. And if there is an objection, as frivolous as it may be, from at least one member of each house, there will be a debate in each of those houses about whether to sustain the objection. Those debates will result in denying the objection. I believe both houses will very soundly deny those objections. And there is nothing that Vice President Pence can do, nor do I think there's anything he's likely to try to do, to derail the very clear will of the people in an election in which President-elect Biden won by over 7 million votes, the first presidential candidate in history to receive more than 80 million votes in an election. and winning the Electoral College by a margin that President Trump himself called a landslide when he achieved the same margin in 2016. So we know what the outcome is going to be. The outcome is going to be that the count will be certified by Congress on Wednesday. It might take some time as the sideshow of Trump loyalists who act in a way that's honestly seditious try to express their loyalty to him. And that will delay things, but it will still result in certification of the Electoral College votes on Wednesday or maybe early Thursday, depending on how late it goes, and President-elect Biden taking the oath of office on January 20th. But we still are in a very dangerous time right now where the President of the United States is acting in a way that is anti-democracy. And he is, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I apologize. I just wanted to ask, you used the word seditious a moment ago. It's a pretty powerful thing to talk about when describing some of the actions that are likely, undertaken by some of these Republican supporters of the president. Why do you say seditious?
Well, the definition of sedition is opposition to legitimate government, especially in a democracy. And we have to call it what it is at some point. I mean, this is not normal in a democracy. We have held an election. The states have held elections. Republican and Democratic election officials have certified the results of those elections. We know who won. The election was an amazing success in the midst of a pandemic, a huge testament to the sheer will and effort of election officials of both parties all around the country. And to now hear political opportunists who think that they may gain some advantage by appealing to Trump loyalists and to Trump himself in these last few days of his administration, it should offend us all. And it does approach sedition. And it's something that many of us hoped in our lives we would never see in the United States of America. But we're seeing it now. And the bad news is these next 16 days are going to be perilous to some degree. We have someone, if you listen to the call with the Georgia Secretary of State, we have someone who is the President of the United States who seems somewhat detached from reality right now. That is concerning. But on the other hand, we know what the outcome is going to be. The outcome is going to be that the duly elected individual who won the presidency is going to take the oath of office on January 20th. He will occupy the White House, and then we will see how things go. I found tonight very unusual. In a way, Donald Trump continued to air his grievances, his completely baseless, fake allegations of problems with the election, which would seem to imply that he thinks he's going to be sitting in that office on January 20th and 21st. And yet, on the other hand, his call to Republican voters to vote for those senators is that if you don't vote for these senators, Democrats will have full control of government. And the fact is, if he truly believed that he was going to be sitting in the Oval Office on January 21st, then actually Republicans would control not only the White House, but the tiebreaker in the Senate, regardless of what happened. So it's very unusual. It's a very unusual argument to be making to Republican voters. And some Republicans that I've talked to in Georgia are very concerned that Republican voters are hearing very mixed messages about whether it's worthwhile for them to show up and vote. And to be clear, the elections in Georgia are going to be secure. And it's important for all Republicans and all Democrats and anyone who's an eligible voter in Georgia. If you haven't voted already, show up and vote. It doesn't matter who you're going to vote for. Make your voice heard tomorrow.
David, I also want to ask you about the president's comments on the Supreme Court. The comments came in the context of his challenges, or the comments were sort of related to his challenges to the results of the presidential election. Let's go ahead and play some of what the president said on that front.
They will pack the Supreme Court with crazed extremists, and I'm not happy with the Supreme Court. They are not stepping up to the plate. They're not stepping up. How about that? We don't have, look at the Supreme Court. President of the United States, I want to file suit. I want to do, and they said, sir, you really can't do that. Why? So they have legal reasons, complex legal reasons it's wrong. if you're the president of the United States and you get defrauded out of an election, you should be able to file a suit, but we can't do that. They say, sir, you don't have standing. How about that? I'm the president. 7 states, you know, I was winning by a lot, and then all of a sudden I was losing by a little, tiny bit, just a little. They could only go so far. They had no idea we were going to do the kind of numbers, so that printing press was really moving. And they say I don't have standing to bring a suit. What kind of a legal system is that? But the Supreme Court has let us down so far.
So, David, remind our viewers, what has the Supreme Court said about the president's legal challenges?
The Supreme Court has had an opportunity to rule on or dismiss several challenges that have moved through the normal process of the courts, and in every single opportunity, they have found that the president's claims lacked merit, lacked standing, lacked an ability to rule in a way that they could offer relief. These are absurd claims in most cases. I mean, I think one of the best examples was the Texas Attorney General's lawsuit, which sought to invalidate over 20 million votes in other states. Imagine someone who considers themselves a conservative, who considers themselves in favor of things like states' rights, arguing to invalidate votes or procedures in another state in which they don't reside. That cuts to the very core of American democracy. And I think it shows that it shows how the courts have held. Whether judges have been appointed by Democrats or Republicans, whether they consider themselves liberals or conservatives, they are patriots, and they adhere to their oath to support the rule of law. I think the most disturbing thing about this, and it almost got to the point of being humorous, is how little the president understands how the Supreme Court works and how our judicial system works. The Supreme Court and his nominees to the Supreme Court are not there to support his claims and to express loyalty to him. They take an oath to the United States Constitution, and they've upheld that oath. And I think that's one of the lessons we've learned from this very troubling time, is that the Supreme Court and the lower courts in the federal government, as well as the state courts, have largely held that Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, if they sit on the judiciary, they're taking their role in our democracy very seriously. And that's one very positive thing we can take from this whole episode.
I want to end, David, with this question about that call over the weekend to Georgia's Secretary of State from President Trump. You referenced it earlier. You know, it struck me at one point during the president's remarks, he said this of both the Secretary of State and also Georgia's governor, Republicans both, as you note. He said, quote, "I'll be here in about a year and a half campaigning against your governor." He went on to say, "I'm going to be campaigning against your governor and your," his words, "crazy Secretary of State." You mentioned that hour-long phone call and the pressure sort of campaign, if you will, that the president mounted very clearly on the Secretary of State, who, in that call, for people who haven't heard it, went through point by point, and as you said, refuted and rebutted the claims that were made. But what else stood out to you, David, as particularly concerning, you know, from a legal standpoint, because it wasn't just the president and the Secretary of State on that call?
Yeah, I think there were several things that stood out. One, how much conspiracy theory media has seeped into the president's consciousness, how he is no longer tethered to reality. And the trouble that we're going to have in kind of rebuilding a common set of facts in this country, where very calmly, I really encourage people to listen to the full call if you have an hour, or at least read the transcript. You'll see very calm, considerate discussion from the Secretary of State and from his lawyer about the facts. And it was completely ignored by the president. I think one other thing that really stood out was the fact that there was a very clear effort to pressure the Secretary of State to threaten possible criminal prosecution, to an attempt to make the Secretary of State and his staff scared that the president might wield federal power against them. And I think, to their great credit, I don't think they felt particularly scared. I think they, being in the right, focusing on process and principle, gives one great power, and certainly the Secretary and his staff have done that. I think the last thing that really stood out to me as a lawyer and as someone who has litigated voting cases, litigated election cases, been in federal court, is there were lawyers with the president during that call. This call was not privileged, and lawyers were actively participating, not just listening in, and engaging in some of this behavior. And I have to tell you, as a lawyer, I really wonder, how did they even let that call happen? But beyond that, how could they allow themselves to debase themselves and to possibly put at risk their law license and incur liability by engaging in this kind of discussion, this clearly improper discussion? I think we're going to learn a lot more about that over time. But it's something that we should be very concerned by, this kind of, I mean, it was almost mob-like behavior that we would expect out of a scene from The Godfather rather than coming from the Oval Office. And I really encourage everyone to listen to that. And then after that, listen to Gabe Sterling's press conference today to get the real facts.
Yeah, two very different styles from those two Georgia officials, but both very clearly pushing back forcefully against these claims. David Becker, it has been a long night. We are very grateful to have your expertise and analysis. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you so much. Good night.